Alrighty, everybody. So, hold on a second. Sorry if there's a little bit of ambient noise here, but this will have to do for now. Um, and sorry if I'm a broken record on this topic, but it's hard to sort of just move on after having spent the 2 months that I did traveling around the country to areas that had been afflicted by riots. But a few days ago, there was another series of riots in Chicago. And Chicago has its own qualities in terms of what the civil unrest looked like, what forms it took. And so when I see these reports of riots, a new round of riots happening in Chicago, I'm extremely unconfident that I'm going to get anything close to the real story of what actually occurred, given what I observed when I was there in late June, where the scope of it, the magnitude was well beyond anything that I would have necessarily gleaned if all I had been doing was following the standard media sources. And there's reason to believe, based on just anecdotal comments that I've heard and seen after these latest riots a few days ago, that the scope of what occurred recently was also fairly enormous. And so this is just confirmation that we have an ongoing trend of rioting throughout the country, but obviously concentrated in a few specific locales now after that first phase in late May, early June, which was massive in terms of its scope. Now it's more isolated, it would seem. But the fact that it's such an enduring mystery as to what the nature of these riots are, who's rioting, how are they transporting themselves around. We hear sort of rumors and reports in Chicago of caravans of rioters. And I heard kind of murmurings about that in Chicago when I was there. But what does it mean for a caravan to be taking people around and enabling them to carry out rioting? Can we get a little bit deeper of a dig into that? Is there an ideological component to these particular riots, as there clearly was in the first round? Or is it simply what you might call non-ideological, or at least not overtly ideological looting, where people just simply want to bust into storefronts and seize whatever goods are available to them in the short period of time that they have access to it? I did watch a few videos put out by the Chicago police of people breaking through windows and taking sunglasses and apparel and things. But that's just one little snapshot. I want to know if there's any insurrectionary ideological motive in instigating these riots, because that's sort of the pattern that was followed in the past, but we just don't have good information on it now, or at least I don't. And so all I can really go on is this incomplete picture that's put out by social media and the local newspapers, in addition to the experience that I can draw on from my own firsthand observations. But at least now, Chicago, its downtown area, is partially shut down. And I wouldn't have known this unless I sought out the info. I'm not in Chicago right now. The downtown area is under nightly restrictions, which will be in effect at least through this weekend. From 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. in Chicago, in the downtown area, bridges are raised. There is a partial shutdown of Lakeshore Drive, which, if you're familiar at all with the area, you know is sort of the main throughway on Lake Michigan. And train service has been limited. And in order to enter the downtown area between the hours of 9 p.m. and 6 a.m., you have to pass through what are called acts administered by the Office of Emergency Management and Communications in Chicago, where you have to provide identification or proof that you live in the area or work in the area. So it's like a partial curfew almost. It's not as strict of a curfew as were widely implemented in May and June. But still, I mean, it's notable. And yet, I don't know, there seems to be like a chronic lack of curiosity here about what the heck is going on. Like, what are the causes of these riots? Who is actually doing them? Just your basic factual accounting of what is happening here would be welcome. If you're interested in what is going on in the country around you, I mean, not complicated inquiries here. And yeah, I mean, you can get bits and pieces when you scan the local media, but I don't know. I mean, relative to the amount of disruption here, where you had lots of rioting, go check out some of the photos this past weekend, and the major commercial center of the city partially shut down. There doesn't seem to be a level of interest that's sort of concomitant with that scale of disruption. So why is that? I mean, it all gets back, I guess, to the narrative game where, I mean, listen, I'm not trying to just be this reflexive contrarian, even though I'm accused of that. However, I mean, just imagine if you had ideological right wingers, for example, of whatever stripe. Maybe they have some racially tinged motivation. Rioting and then causing the major downtown area of a city to be shut down. I mean, don't you think that the entire National Press Corps would be swooping in without a second thought to provide every last detail about what's going on in terms of the logistics of how the rioting operation is being orchestrated, in terms of their beliefs, in terms of just their sheer identity? Who are they? Where do they live exactly? What is their political agenda? Let's hash that out a little bit more robustly. The editorial desks or the assignment desks of all the country's leading media outlets would be ablaze with activity in terms of filling in the knowledge gaps here. And yet there's just like nothing remotely on that level in terms of this summer of rioting, with the latest example being what's happening now in Chicago. I guess, are people just numb to the fact that maybe Chicago has these sort of endemic qualities that incline residents to carry out rioting and looting? Yeah, I mean, that's true to an extent, but there is something still that seems quite novel about these particular kinds of activities that we see now with increasing frequency in Chicago. And I'm not interested in getting to the whole, what about black on black crime game that you see often in, right-wing infotainment media. To the extent that there's a crime problem in Chicago, I think it should be addressed and portrayed as rationally as possible without getting into these kind of cheap blame game incendiary type tactics that are just framed in such a way to advance a certain partisan political agenda. But at the same time, the lack of interest here in this significant socio-political phenomenon is itself driven by a political motive. Or otherwise, there would be a level of coverage that is congruous with the magnitude of what's occurring here. And there just hasn't been, and that's been a feature of this entire riot summer going back to the beginning, as was made abundantly, indisputably clear to me in going around myself around the country for as long as I did. So, it's definitely dispiriting if you feel like, as a consumer of media and news, that you're getting the full story here. I mean, you never really did, but now it's just amazingly blatant. And, so you're just left to engage in sort of guesswork as to what's going on in the third largest city in the country, which is, on some basic level, just, deeply absurd. Okay, so just wanted to draw your attention to that, and I'll answer a couple of super chats should they come in. Walter asks, why do you no longer appear on the Hill Rising show? Do they no longer invite you? I feel like they've started pandering to their leftist audience. I don't watch the show regularly. I never really did. I guess I pick up a segment here and there if there's something that piqued my interest. I'll go on if I'm invited. I guess the last time I was on was now, a number of months ago, maybe 6, something like that, maybe a little more. That's just how sometimes things get scheduled. So I don't know. Don't have a firm explanation for it, and I don't, spend a whole lot of time thinking about it. I do whatever media more or less is presented to me to do. But in terms of whether they have started pandering to their leftist audience, I just don't know, because I'm not familiar enough to say. Esteve asks, why do you say that Trump is the first non-American exceptionalist president? Okay, change of pace there in terms of the questioning. The phrasing that I've used, and this sort of dates back to an article that I wrote in August, I believe, of 2018, if I'm not mistaken, is I labeled Trump the first post-exceptionalist president. So Trump will occasionally riff on the kind of customary American exceptionalism pablum that's written for him in speeches and talking points by his kind of establishment Republican speechwriters. But there's more than enough reason to believe that he doesn't really buy into that dogma on any kind of visceral, intrinsic level. Number one, just based on his own statements, he's on many occasions repudiated some of the core tenets of American exceptionalism, such as his relatively infamous interview with Bill O'Reilly before Bill O'Reilly was canceled at the very beginning of the Trump presidency at the halftime of the Super Bowl in 2017, where O'Reilly was kind of pestering Trump about Putin. And Trump's response was something like, oh, yeah, maybe they do kill people in Russia. Maybe they don't. But what do you think? We're so innocent? I don't have the exact quote off the top of my head, but it was something to that effect. And that kind of statement is sort of an inherent contradiction to the American exceptionalism ethos, which is that yeah, America is exceptionally, quote, innocent and moral and virtuous, and that must be defended at all costs because there's almost like a mystical quality about America given its founding and given the sacred global mission that we've been solemnly sworn to carry out since, I guess you could probably call it the late 1800s, when you had kind of manifest destiny doctrine, Theodore Roosevelt promulgating really an imperialistic vision of American global power. But then post World War II, being the lone superpower, not the lone superpower, but being one of two superpowers that was the embodiment of this creed of, capitalism and markets and a certain depiction of American values that need to be spread around the world. And then post 1989, the lone superpower, although now clearly we have China, that's a separate sort of consideration. But throughout Republican and Democratic administrations, you had basic agreement on the core premises of American exceptionalism. But Trump is more a transactionalist than an exceptionalist. To the extent that he wields American power, it's to kind of get something in return rather than doing it from this kind of place of fuzzy moralism that has informed and animated American exceptionalism going back decades. So when I say post exceptionalism, it's because I think Trump represents sort of a rupture in the tenuous but still existent consensus around what the role of American power is in the world up until 2016. You could argue possibly that Obama posed something of a challenge to that consensus in a way, but not nearly as much as Trump, I would say, not nearly as much as Obama's right-wing detractors often alleged of him. I mean, Obama bought into that sort of American credo, whereas Trump just repudiates it. But he sort of layers that on top of nationalistic slash patriotic bluster that causes people to miss how he is in a potent way a significant wrinkle in the sort of American imperial hegemonic creed that had predated him to let's say dating back to World War II, but even further, really. So that's why I say post exceptionalism. He's post a consensus that had been firmly in place on a bipartisan basis relating to the role of America in the world and the perceived necessity of exporting American cultural, economic, and military values, quote unquote, the world over. Now, Trump has continued some of those policies, but it's less likely to be expressed in such a way that fits into that kind of post-war ethos. And yeah, that's roughly speaking what I mean. I hope that made sense. But yeah, that's sort of a different topic, and but that's something that needs to be expounded on a little further, and I hope to do that at some point. Um, there's a longer written thing inside me that I have been stifling for a while. I'm talking about something book length that you kind of have to be in the right frame of mind in order to really focus on. And I had thought I was going to do that genuinely after Biden uh, sewed up the nomination, But then shortly thereafter, you had the riots, and my plans changed. And now we're getting into the heat of the election season. It's going to be a different election season because there's going to be very little actual campaigning. Not that attending actual campaign events is all that informative anyway. Although I definitely think it was, you had to go to Trump rallies in 2016 to have a full sense of what that phenomenon was about. But now you just sit around and watch Zoom. I don't know. The point being that once I do get into the correct frame of mind to actually sit down and put these thoughts on a page at greater length, that whole notion of Trump as the first post-exceptionalist president is going to be a component of it. So thank you for that question. Anyway, yeah, that'll do it for now. Have a wonderful day. Stay safe. Stay cool. You get the idea. Talk to you later.